Welcome to our next session on how we got our Bible. Here at CityLight Seattle, we've been working very hard to get content material provided for you on the history of how we got the canon and also how we got the text and the differences in them and so forth. Numerous questions have come in over the last 6 months. More than 1,000 probably emails and messages collectively have asked questions on how to deal with problems within the text. How do we know we have a Bible that is trustworthy? And so what we decided to do is, since we saw there was a great interest, John Beasley and I spent numerous conversations on how to bridge the gap between the academic world and also the church. The average person who just likes to sit in church, open their Bible, and learn from their pastor. How can we bridge these two worlds together? We recognize that most would probably not pick up the book and read Myths and Mistakes of New Testament Textual Criticism or other works like it, but you would listen to the videos of those who are participants in writing. And one of my special guests that I have with me today is Dr. Peter Gurry, who is one of the editors. You've probably heard his name mentioned or seen in some of the articles we have written, as well as his friend Elijah Hickson, who we've mentioned numerous times as well. And what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about one of the biggest questions that we get, and that is on textual variances, which is dealing in his chapter of this book, in chapter number 10. And so far, we've brought on a few guests just to give us a reminder, and you can go back on YouTube, and you can also find this on Facebook. We had Timothy Mitchell come on, and he discussed original documents, first century transmission, and how those were sent out into the public, and how they were seen in a first, second century context. And then we brought in Timothy Berg, who was not one of the writers of the book, but does a lot of study in the English language and how we got the Bible there. And he demonstrated the reason the King James came into existence and how that affected the English Bibles of today. And then last time we had Dr. John Mead on, who dealt with the Old Testament. We talked about Old Testament textual variances. We talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls, some of the older Greek manuscripts of the Old Testament as compared to the Masoretic text, and so forth. We also talked about Origen's hexapla and so forth. So today we have my special guest, Peter Gurry, with us. Peter, give us a little bit of a background of yourself, and we'll jump into some questions.
Sure. Thanks for having me. Glad to hear that you got folks at your church who are interested in this question. So my name is Peter Gurry. I teach New Testament at Phoenix Seminary here in Arizona, and I also co-direct the Text and Canon Institute with John Mead, who you all met last time. And together, our mission at the Institute is to produce good scholarship on this question of how we got the Bible, and then also to bring that scholarship to the church and help Christians understand and appreciate the history of the Bible. So that's what I do now. I've got 5 kids. I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio. I've lived in Chicago, Dallas, Cambridge, and now Phoenix. So we've been all over.
Tell us a little bit about some of your books. Obviously, this was one of your big ones. You and Elijah were co-editors in this and wrote chapters in it, and even I think co-wrote a chapter together, if I'm not mistaken, at the very beginning. Tell us about some of the other works that you've done as well.
Yeah, sure. So Myths and Mistakes kind of grew out of it was really Elijah's brainchild, and both of us were doing PhDs or finishing up PhDs in text criticism at the time, and we were evangelicals, so we've grown up with even in evangelicalism, and we know that text criticism is often a matter of apologetic interest, and Christians oftentimes have a lot of questions about it. And especially as a result of the popularity of Bart Ehrman's 2005 book, Misquoting Jesus, something kind of shifted then, and it was like before that time, text criticism would occasionally get talked about in apologetics, and after Bart Ehrman, it was like it always got talked about, and you kind of had to talk about it with people. And so we actually wrote Myths and Mistakes not to answer Bart Ehrman, because we kind of felt like people had already answered his objections. But we actually wrote it to kind of correct some of the misinformation that has sprung up in answer to him, So as apologists feel the need to answer him, some of the nuances and important details of a technical field like text criticism can get lost and get diluted by the time they reach an apologist. And so we just kind of realized that apologetics is important, and we wanted to help apologists. So that's the aim of the book. Yeah. There. The other books I've written 2. One's on my shelf over there, sorry. But they're both on the same topic. I've got the smaller one here. This one is the simplified version of my dissertation, which is a new approach to textual criticism, which I co-wrote with Tommy Wasserman. And it's on what's called the coherence-based genealogical method, which is a mouthful, but I did not pick the name. But it is a very important computer-assisted method of doing text criticism that's now being used to edit the Greek New Testament that my Greek students use at the seminary, and that so most pastors will use in the years ahead. So I wrote my dissertation really to test the method and see if it's any good, and I want to know why it was changing my Greek New Testament, basically. So
that's awesome, and we thank you for sharing that with us. And again, we'll make some of these available to our listeners, where they can go to the link and find these very things. Bringing up Bart Ehrman is going to start us right into something that you mentioned in your book. On page 193 in your chapter, you talked about John Mill's work in 1707, which influenced our really understanding of counting textual variances. Though most of his work was, from what I understand, based on Stephanus's Greek text, he chose to leave almost an apparatus of differences, and I think his number was around 30,000. I know Bart Ehrman uses that number and kind of does his own little math equation in his head to come up with his number of textual variances. So when we look at the New Testament, Peter, how many textual variances do we roughly have? We obviously don't know the exact number, but in a healthy way, how can we estimate that number?
Right, so that's a good question. So what John Mill did that was new was he compared a lot of manuscripts and then put them all in his edition. So I've got a reprint of his edition, and it's a thick beast. It's a big book. Nobody really knows if he has 30,000 variants. That's always been an estimate itself. If any of your listeners are bored the next couple weeks at home, you can get online if you want a really fun project. Do me a favor and find a PDF of John Mill's edition and actually count the number, because I'd be really interested to know if it's actually 30,000. It may be, but 30,000 has always just been an estimate. But ever since Mill produced that, people have kind of given these estimate of how many variants there are. And so one thing I did in my work on trying to estimate how many there are is I kind of just tracked the number that's estimated, and you can kind of see it gradually growing over time. So after Mill, at some point, somebody estimates 70,000, then it jumps to 100,000, then 120, 150, 200, and Bart was one of the first to at least popularize the number 400,000. So Bart would say, maybe there's 200,000, maybe there's as many as 400,000. And then even since Bart, one text critic had suggested maybe there's 750,000. And the problem with all these numbers is that none of these folks ever said how they got their estimate. And in a few cases where they did, there was very good reason to question the way they got it. Okay, so, when Bart says 200 to 400,000, that's just his kind of educated guess, right? So what I did when I was doing my dissertation is I thought, we have some really good editions of portions of the New Testament where people have compared all the known Greek manuscripts that we have. So if I just went through those editions and actually counted myself, I could use those numbers to then extrapolate to the rest of the New Testament. Does that make sense? So what you have to do is you got to start with a section of the New Testament where we've done the work of collating all or nearly all the Greek manuscripts, and then as a matter of counting and providing a pretty simple formula of variance per word, and then you extrapolate from there. So what I found was it's probably better estimated about 500,000. So ironically, Bart Ehrman is too conservative on his estimate. Okay, but unlike most of the past estimates, mine is actually based on a clear method and based on clear additions, clear collations of manuscripts. Does that make sense?
It does. And you use 3 examples in here of John 18, Philemon, and Jude, I believe on page 194, and you came up with some statistical variances per word from all 3 of those. Now, explain a little bit about the variant, too, before you jump into that. A lot of the listeners, they hear these numbers, 400,000, 700,000, all of which are higher than the number of words in the New Testament. And this is the number that's been really freaking a lot of people out. One of the most asked questions on variances to our ministry, Peter, is how can we ever trust wording when there's more problems than words? And I think that Bart Ehrman doesn't do a good job of clarifying the types of variances that there are. So can you kind of fill people on that so that they don't hear that number and go, whoa, 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 that's more than words that we have in the New Testament. How could I ever
Right.
trust?
Right. Yep. So that's usually the response to people, and it's a what I would say is the reasonable response to the number by itself. Does that make sense? No, I
Yes.
want to reassure people that when they react that way to the bare number, they're not being crazy, because it is pretty shocking. That's one of the reasons
Sure.
why Bart likes to use it, frankly. But any number by itself doesn't really tell you much, right? And the same is true in this case, right? If we just told you the number of think about what we're hearing about the stats for coronavirus right now. Okay, and I don't want to downplay the significance at all. Okay, I think we all know we need to take this seriously. But if you just hear the number of deaths per day, it sounds really shocking until you compare it to something else, right? And then when you compare it to something else, like say the number of fatalities from car accidents or from like the flu or something else, you realize, relatively speaking, it's a small number, right? Now the reason we're taking it so seriously is because we realize it could easily get out of hand and then balloon to crazy numbers, right? But you've got to keep numbers in perspective, and that's my main point there. So you have to keep this number of variance in perspective too. And one of the ways I like to do that is to ask the question, why do we have so many estimated variants? Okay. One answer to that could be, theoretically could be, well, we have so many variants because scribes were really terrible, right? So we have so many variants because scribes just change the text all the time, right? And that's one possible answer, but it's not the right answer. The right answer is we have so many variants because the New Testament got copied so many times. Okay, so to put the number in perspective, let's take John 18 as an example. Okay, given the number of variants we have in John 18, which is a little over 3,000. Okay, we have those 3,000 variants in over 1,600 manuscripts. Okay. And every one of those manuscripts of John 18 has an average of about 800 words for John 18, right? Okay, so multiply 800 words by 1,600 manuscripts that contain those words, and what you are left with is that scribes copied total 1.3 million words. Are you with me on this?
Yes.
Because each time a scribe copies John 18, he's recopying every word in John 18,
Yes.
or more or less every word, right? Okay. So every one of those 1,600 plus manuscripts has about 800 Greek words in it, which gives you a number of about 1.3 million words copied. Okay. Now put 3,000 variants in relation to the number of words copied, and it seems a lot smaller. Oh, only 3,000 copy a total of 1.3 million words to get those 3,000 different.
That's good.
Variants. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a very good way to break it down instead of just throwing a number out there and everybody's like, whoa.
Correct.
It's not thinking realistically enough. It's not thinking
realistically enough, because again, it compares what Bart does is he says things like there are more variants than words in the New Testament, which is true, of course, but it's not a fair comparison because you're using a fixed number in one case, which is the number of words in the New Testament, which doesn't really change, okay, to the number of variants, which changes with every new manuscript we discover, for example, right? If you only had one manuscript of the New Testament, you would have 0 variants.
Right.
Right?
But you might be missing something.
You might be missing something, but you wouldn't know it, but you still wouldn't have any variants, right? There'd be nothing to vary it from. If you have 2 manuscripts, now you start to have a few variants. If you had 3, now you have more. If you had 4, you can see how this works, right? It's kind of an exponential growth. Now it does tend to level off eventually once you get to the later period, but the point is every new manuscript we discover, it almost always has some unique variants that we didn't know about before, and they're almost never worthy of serious consideration for the original text. But the fact is, you try to copy 800 words and see if you make any mistakes, right? I mean, every time John 18 was copied, that was an opportunity to introduce a new variant that hadn't existed before. So actually, I think 3,000 variants out of 1.3 million words is overall not that bad, okay? Now, we're still left as scholars to try to work through those 3,000 variants in John 18 so that we can produce a good version of John's Gospel in a Greek, printed Greek edition, which then gets translated into English, which our people in church then read, okay? And so from there, it helps to realize that about half of the variants are nonsensical, okay? That is, of those 3,000 variants in John 18, almost half of them are meaningless variants. That is, they literally are not words. They're not real words in Greek. And you say, how could that happen? Well, again, You try to copy out John 18 and see if you end up with anything that's an accidental nonsense, right? You do it in your emails all the time. I do this. Try to write the word the, and instead of spelling it T-H-E, I spell it T-E-H, right? Now, whoever I'm writing the email to knows exactly what I intended to type.
Sure.
So actually the meaning is not affected at all by that, right? Because they knew what I meant to write. It's such an obvious mistake.
Right.
And a lot of these nonsensical mistakes in Greek are that way. It's very obvious to us what the scribe meant to write, and the pen just got away from him, if I can speak like that. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
So that's a large part of the variance. Another very significant portion of the variance are they make sense, but they're still obviously errors. Okay? So a scribe has replaced one word with another similar word. Okay? Or they're a variant that's found in only one or two manuscripts. And so out of 1,600 manuscripts, unless it's an early manuscript that it's found in, the chances of it being original are pretty slim. Right? Okay. So it's an idiosyncratic mistake of that particular scribe. Once you work through all those kind of variants and try to cut out the ones that are nonsense, cut out the ones that we call singular readings, cut out the ones that are simply obvious errors, we could ask the question, how many are we left with? And here's where I think it's helpful to look at an edition like a Greek edition. So here's my Nestle Aland Greek New Testament that I make my students use, that I use to do my scholarship. Okay, in John 18, it has about 154 variant readings for John 18. Okay, so out of the 3,000, there's 154 in my academic edition of the New Testament. If I were to pull off my other Greek New Testament that's designed for Bible translators, we would find that it only has 10 variants for John 18. Okay, so only 10 that they think translators need to be aware of. And then if you ask the question, well, what do commentators discuss? Look at, say, something like D.A. Carson's commentary on John is very good commentary. He discusses 3 of them. C.K. Barrett, in his excellent John commentary, discusses 8. And then if you look at English Bibles to see which ones do English Bible translators think, okay, these are the ones that are really important for an English Bible reader to know about. The answer is in a check of the ESV, the NIV, the NRSV, and the Net Bible, which the Net Bible has tons of footnotes, okay, if you know anything about the Net Bible. None of those 4 English translations has a single footnote at John 18. Okay, does that make sense? So
yes,
that means out of the 3,000 or so variants, 4 separate English Bible translation teams said, hey, there aren't any variants that rise to the level where we need to alert an English Bible reader, right? Either because all of them are easily enough resolved, or they don't affect the translation or interpretation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so
another way to
wouldn't even notice.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Most people wouldn't even notice. So with that, what would be your suggestion? And I just thought about this when you were saying that. What do you tell a Christian who does come up to a portion where their translation does note a textual variant? I mean, you're going to run into it in Mark 16. You're going to run into it at John 7:53. There's other places, Acts 8:37. What should a Christian who doesn't understand the concepts, but they get that note? And I think sometimes the translations might even do a little bit of a disservice by not like clarifying. It just says, well, the best manuscripts don't have this.
Yes.
How should they, because most listeners, you might have guys on here that are reading from a New King James that has the majority text reading, and the Nestle Aland 27th edition, I believe, is in that. What do you do with somebody who has an ESV or even a King James that doesn't mark anything at all? You won't have that problem.
Yep.
But how should a Christian sitting in the pew reading their devotion, they come up to John 7:53 and they see this note at the top of the story in brackets everywhere? How should they view those? What should their response be, or how can they understand the issues better?
Yeah, so I'll say a couple things. One is you should take your English Bible footnotes as kind of signs, not as detailed explanations, right? An English Bible footnote can never give you all the detail you need. But what it can do, and what they do well, I think, is alert you to a difficult problem. In other words, I always tell my students, if your English Bible has gone to the trouble of giving you a footnote, which they do not like to do, right? Bible translators are notorious, especially the publisher side of it, right? They do not like to print footnotes if they do not have to, because they want to leave their text as uncluttered as possible,
Sure.
Okay, to make it easier to read. So if they have put a footnote in, you can be pretty sure that, hey, this is pretty significant. Does that make sense?
Yes.
In other words, there are more far more textual variants than are footnoted in your English Bible, and in some cases, some of them even matter, and they still don't make it into a footnote, which tells you that if there is a footnote, you can be pretty sure that this matters. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Now, it doesn't mean it, when I say it matters, we can ask the question, what does it matter for? And we could talk about that, because not everything is, rises to the same level of importance as everything else. But what I would say to people is, at some point, you're going to have to do some digging. Your Bible alone is not enough. Unless it's like a study Bible, you could start there, okay? So a good study Bible will almost always discuss the most important variants, certainly the big ones, like the woman caught in adultery, or Mark 16, or 1 John 5:7 probably. Okay, so you could start with the study Bible. That might be a good place as a first stop, and then probably at some point you're going to want to advance to like a commentary, and maybe start with a simpler commentary if you're not used to reading commentaries. And then certainly if you're a person who's, say, teaching a Bible study, or certainly for a pastor, that's where church leaders really need to have a lot more skills and be able to dig deeper, right? So not everyone in our churches needs to be able to operate at the same level of technical ability in studying the Bible, but we all need some people to be able to do that. Does that
Now, let
make
me
sense?
ask you this, Peter. You brought up the pastors. This question comes up all the time. I mean, there probably isn't a month that doesn't go by where this question doesn't come into myself, John, or one of the leaders there. What do you do as a pastor when you come up to these problems? And recently my church came up here in Spartanburg, Greenville, came up to John 7:53 through 8:11. I had my opinion about it. I've written very, very extensively on it, and people at CityLight know that. I spent over 200 hours studying that passage, debated Nick Sayers on it. We'll be debating Jeff Riddle here in a few months on it. What should a pastor do without harming his people? Like a Bart Ehrman drop a bomb, like, well, it's not the best manuscripts. Like, so what should a pastor do? Because pastors really struggle with, I don't know how to address this without offending somebody. I'm going to make somebody mad. So how should a pastor deal with it if they're preparing a sermon and a big one comes up like 1 John 5:7, Acts 8:7?
So this is good, and there's pastoral wisdom here that needs to come into play, and part of that's going to have to do with your particular church, right? So if let's say you're pastoring a church that you are shepherding away from a King James only position, you're gonna need to address it differently than if you're, say, pastoring at a mega church where most people have never even read the King James. You know what I mean? So, or imagine you're pastoring a church where most of your congregation is new believers and they're not even familiar with the story of the woman caught in adultery, right? Now, most people are, but it's possible you're in a church where you have so many new believers and they're so uninfluenced by Christianity that they don't even know, right? In that case, you can address it pretty differently, okay? I'd say a couple things. One thing is it can be helpful to address the issue of textual criticism before you get to a passage that people care a lot about, like the woman caught in adultery. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It can be really helpful if you have done some of the spade work ahead of time, so that your sermon series through John is not the first time they've ever heard you talk about text criticism from the pulpit. Okay. Now, your sermons should not be text critical, seminars. Okay. Please hear me. But occasionally, it may be appropriate in preaching to say, and just so you know, there may be a footnote in your English Bible, and that's a variant, and here's why I take whatever view I do, okay? But if you haven't been able to do that, and so the first time you're getting to talk about text criticism from the pulpit, then you've got to probably take it head on, and you've got to give your people some basics about the reliability of the transmission as a whole, but how that there are still passages like John 7:53 through 8:11 where it's not found in a large number of our Greek manuscripts, right? And certainly not in our earliest ones. And so you've got to walk people through it and help them see, how does textual criticism work, right? And then you have to answer the secondary question, which can be related, but that is whether it's still canonical or not, right? Whether you're still going to preach it or not. My own personal view on the woman caught in adultery is I would probably not preach it.
Yeah.
The ending of Mark, I would be much more comfortable preaching that, because the disparity between the number of manuscripts that each one of those passages found in is so significant. I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of manuscripts that the woman caught in adultery is simply not found in. I forget the exact number now, but it's a lot. It's significant.
Yeah, and some of the better ones and the more obscure ones specifically. And that's one of the things that I had a a young girl, probably in her late teens, early 20s. She had just gotten saved a few months before she read it. And, you know, people always send you to John when you get saved. And she read the note in her, I think it was the NIV. I think she was using the NIV. And she read the note at the top and sent me a message on Facebook freaking out. Like, well, what does this mean? Like, what is I don't understand what that is. Are we saying this isn't a real story? And thankfully that was one I was very familiar with. And but people are starting to catch on to some of these little notes. Yep. And I think the church has not done a good job of informing their readers and their listeners to pay attention, understand what's going on. Don't just have a Bible, actually read it and understand that there's notes left for you. There are realities in history with different readings, and we have to examine these things. We can't ignore them. We can't close our eyes to them, because that's breeding ground for the apostasy that we're seeing in a lot of the young people who do read for the first time Bart Ehrman's book. And then they're just like, well, you know, I'm done with Christianity. I'm done with the scripture. And some of that's due to the fact the church did not prepare their people for this.
Yes. So, and I think what can easily happen for people is a couple things. And you do see this a lot with text criticism. People who have grown up in the church and then they're in college and they're hearing for the first time about the problems and the questions that critical scholars have about the Bible. And it's disorienting to them not only because they don't have answers to those things, but even more so because they weren't told about them. And so what can often happen for young people is they don't just feel like, well, I can't trust the Bible because of all these objections. It's even more so, well, I can't trust the people that raised me in the faith because either they misled me or they hid things from me. Right? And so they actually feel, not just they feel like, well, the Bible's not trustworthy, but Christians aren't trustworthy. Right?
Yeah, they feel
lied to. That can be they feel lied to, right? And betrayed in some cases. And so we have to be, especially pastors have to be very wise in not every sermon needs to deal with, you know, the doubts of critical scholarship for sure. But if you're never dealing with it, you're creating a scenario in which you're not preparing your people well. Because Bart Ehrman would. I was just driving home last night from school, and Bart Ehrman was on NPR again, and I thought maybe it was a replay, but it wasn't. I guess he's got a new book out on heaven and hell, and you know, he's talking about how there is no doctrine of heaven and hell in the Bible at all, right? That's like a later development, and really the Old Testament just presents a view of people have no souls, and they're just bodies, and there is no view really of the afterlife. I'm thinking, like, the interviewer's just eating it up, like she clearly doesn't know the Bible at all. She doesn't even have any ground with which to, you know, object to what he's saying, and certainly she doesn't seem to care to, even if she did know enough to object. But, you know, somebody encounters a person like Bart Ehrman, and he is intelligent. And he's winsome, and he does know what he's talking about usually, in the sense of, like, he's not an idiot. Right?
No.
He's not some crackpot out there. He's been studying the Bible for decades. And so a student can encounter something like that, and if it's the first time, they don't just feel like, oh my goodness, I didn't know this, but oh my goodness, this was hidden from me. Right.
Yeah, I remember the first time I was 2 years into pastoring the first church. I was probably about 22, 23, right around that age. I was studying out of the book of Acts. And at this point, I was a King James onlyist, TR onlyist. And I came to a portion where I was looking at my Greek New Testament and the King James, and I recognized for the first time that the King James wasn't even always consistent with the TR. And I mean, I'm telling you, I didn't eat for 3 days. I mean, that was a world. I mean, it was a bomb drop. And then I started realizing there wasn't one TR, there are many TRs. And then I started learning, oh, there's something called textual variances. I mean, my world was shattered for months. And it was a heavy blow. And one of the things that John Beasley was in the same boat. And one of the things that John Beasley and I at CityLight are trying to do, and most of the pastors on the staff there grew up that same way, is we're trying to ease the blow. So that people don't have to be like we were for the first time. They're sitting down, and it's like, that doesn't read the same. And
that's right. I think the other thing I would say about that is it's really important for pastors not to inculcate a brittle view of the Bible on their people. I think one of the problems with King James onlyists is they have such a brittle view. Their view of Scripture is so brittle, actually, because everything hangs on their absolute certainty about it.
Yep.
And I always want to say, are you absolutely certain about the meaning of every passage in the Bible? Of course not. So why do I have to be absolutely certain about the text of it in every point, right?
Yes.
So what we need to be thinking more carefully about is not, do I have absolute certainty, but do I have adequate certainty? And I always tell people when it comes to text criticism, I don't just have enough certainty, I have more than enough.
More than enough.
But that's partly because I haven't raised the bar the way King James only is to where it has to be absolute, right?
It's all or nothing.
All or nothing. And I just don't have that view of all or nothing. So once I let that go, once I let go of the all or nothing view, then I actually have a lot of space of what's good enough, and then I find that actually what I have is more than good enough for what I need. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I agree. It took a long time to get to that point, and I would actually say, and I can speak for all the leadership at CityLight right now, we have a stronger view of Scripture and a more dependable view where we're not shaking like we don't know what God's Word says. Actually, we actually can defend it historically, and we can also engage atheists. And the city of Seattle is a very skeptical city, and the people will take time to listen and read things that they normally would not, because we're not speaking from that absolute certainty view, and there's actually realities being discussed. So it's good that.
What happens when you have that brittle absolute certainty view, right, is that you kind of have to just ignore certain evidence, right?
Of course.
Oh well, like when I debated Jeff Riddle, I asked him about this variant in Matthew's gospel where Stephanus's version switches the order between his 1550 and 5051 edition. And it was like, if you can't handle that in your view of Scripture, then it's time to get a better view of Scripture, right? You don't need to throw the Bible out. You need to throw your very bad view of the Bible out.
Yeah,
right?
That's right. Absolutely. I agree 100%. Let's move into another section. There's this tension. Bentley came to a statement you quoted on page 195 in the book, Peter, and you mentioned he had said something along the lines of, and you concluded, the cause of the problem can supply us with the solution, meaning the problem is we have a lot of manuscripts, which means we have a lot of variances, but that's also part of the solution. But there's a tension with that too, because I think it was, I'm trying to remember who wrote the section, but there was a statement earlier in the book that basically more manuscripts isn't always a good thing, can mean more problems. That might have been chapter 2 or 3 in the book.
Right.
I think it was Peterson that wrote that. And so there's this tension of more isn't always better. It can mean more problems. But at the same time, the problem can also present solutions. How do we deal with that tension of having a lot of manuscripts?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the first thing to say is part of Jacob's argument in his chapter is that more is not always better because you may just have more of the same. So in that sense, if we discover a new 15th century manuscript and it looks like 100 other 15th century manuscripts, great. That's certainly great news, and we're excited, right? I don't want to downplay it. But text critically, it's not like, oh, that new 15th century manuscript is now going to, confirm that we have the original text, whereas before we were completely uncertain about it, right? It's not like that. So yes, we can get very excited about new discoveries, and we do, but it's not like every new discovery suddenly, now finally we have what we needed all along, right? No, we have more than enough. If we just didn't discover another new manuscript for the rest of human history, we'd have plenty to work with, right? Mm-hmm. I always try to remind my students that it only takes one good manuscript to end up with a good text of the New Testament, right? And I just happen to think that we have a lot of good manuscripts that have good texts. Yes. It's just that they're not perfect texts, right? And so that then leads to the work of text criticism. So in terms of the argument that Bentley's making, though, there's certainly it's not an infallible principle that more manuscripts is necessarily better, and I don't think that's what he's saying. But rather, he's saying because he's saying the differences in our manuscripts can, for example, become a way that we can relate them to each other. So the work that I did in my dissertation all about trying to relate the texts of manuscripts to each other using their differences. And the better we can relate their texts to each other, the better we can know which ones have good texts and which ones have not as good texts, right? Mm-hmm. And so the variants themselves can actually be a way of do this. I use examples sometimes of a family tree. If you want to know who your great-great-great-grandparents are, it helps you to be able to distinguish your aunt from your sister, right? Okay. And then your aunt from your great aunt, and your great aunt from your grandpa, okay? And the better you can know where each person in your family fits in the family tree, the better chance you have of getting back to farther up the tree. So same thing with this. The better we can relate text to each other, the better chance we have of knowing which ones are the most important, which ones are not the most important manuscripts. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think actually Bart Ehrman makes a statement similar to that. And I don't even know if it was in his book or if it was in the margin or in the back. I can't remember. But he talks about the connection, and this is a big one, of P75 and Vaticanus, the connection there, and that there seems to be, they weren't direct descendants, but that they were attached to a similar stream, kind of like that tree you just talked about. And that's significant because we're talking about early, or mid 4th century with Vaticanus, and 175 to 200 for P75. That's significant. So is that kind of like what you're referring to? Those attachments are important and they actually help us?
Yep. So we actually use the differences between manuscripts to help better relate them. So, for example, if 3 manuscripts all have some really quirky reading, and we know it's a quirky reading, we know it's not original, okay? That weird non-original reading is still really valuable to us as text critics because it tells us that those 3 manuscripts have a closer relationship to each other than they have to the rest of the manuscript tradition, right? So in other words, back to the family tree example, it can be helpful to know that your weird Uncle Bob is weird Uncle Bob. Does that make sense? So, and the difference is the things that make Bob weird are actually, even though they're not the original, they're not the great-great-grandparent that you're looking for, they can still be helpful for you in saying, well, we know Bob's not my great-great-great-uncle or great-grandpa. Does that make sense?
Let me ask you this with a specific codex. Is that why people still continue in textual criticism? Because this manuscript gets asked about all the time is Codex D. Yeah. Is that why that one is considered a valuable manuscript? Because it does have some of those Uncle Bob moments, if you want to talk.
That is the best description of Codex Beza ever. Codex Beza is absolutely the weird Uncle Bob of the New Testament manuscripts. Yeah, it's still valuable. The other thing with Codex Beza is that it's still 5th century, so it's real early, right?
You're right.
And precisely because it is pretty weird, it attracts a lot of interest, right? Just like Uncle Bob does at the family, at the family reunion. But even then. If you know that Uncle Bob, sorry, I keep having to use this illustration, but if Uncle Bob is your Uncle Bob, he's still closer related to you than your great-great-great-grandfather, right?
Sure.
And so, sorry, maybe reversing the analogy now, but
no, you're fine.
Beza is 5th century, and therefore temporally it's still closer to the autographs than, say, a 15th century manuscript, right?
Sure.
So all things being equal, which they are not always equal, especially with Beza, all things being equal, we might be more interested in what Beza says, at least when it's not being weird, than we are in what a 15th century manuscript says.
I know it had some weird. Yeah, oh yeah, it does. And I think that's so interesting how the uniquenesses of some of these manuscripts. Like I have a facsimile in here of Codex W sitting right over here, and it's got that Freer Logion reading at the end of Mark, and it makes it unique. Jerome references a similar reading in a manuscript if it was, or maybe a potential similar one. Those do make them unique, but they help us, and that's your point. They actually do help us. It's not a bad thing.
And the other thing too to keep in mind is if all we had was Codex Beza, we would think that's what the New Testament said, right? But because we have so many other manuscripts, the weirdness of Codex Beza is that much clearer. Is that to us? Is that, you know what I mean? It's that much clearer that, hey, this is, in my opinion, this is a textual outlier. And so, especially when Beza, like for example, Beza is the only Greek manuscript that has the reading that Jesus becomes angry in Mark 1:41.
Yes.
And I just think I think it's nuts, frankly, to follow it there. Given what I know of the character of Beza, that Beza, when it is by itself or in a small group of other manuscripts, it is exactly that. It's weird. Why would I follow it, Mark 1:41?
Doesn't Dr. Ehrman use that example all the time?
Yeah. Now he's not the Dan Wallace, I think, is pretty convinced that the Beza reading there is original, and it's usually for internal reasons. It's usually because they think, well, no scribe would create the reading that Jesus got angry there. And that's a legitimate argument.
Sure.
But I just think, at least in terms of external evidence, why would I ever follow Beza when it's all by itself like that? I just have every reason to ignore Beza.
Yeah, it's an amazing thing how you see readings like that, but they make us think at least. And thankfully God has blessed us with these, and I think that's the main point, is we have so many manuscripts, and many of them in the early stages now, with papyri in addition to a lot of the uncial texts, and then you have it spread out all over the world. You have older Byzantine gospel readings like in Alexandrinus that are connecting in places in that part of the world. I mean, so there's so much. God has given us a rich amount of manuscripts so that we're not left with just like we have a better scenario than even a lot of the Quran, because they have one stream, they killed a second, and whereas we have numerous places in the world, then we have patristic writers, we have church fathers citing it, and it's like, wow, we have an abundance of wealth in this.
We do. No, we do. And that's why text critics will often speak about the blessing and the curse, right? The blessing is we have a lot of material to work with. The curse is we have a lot of material to work with, right? So as a Christian, the blessing is, yeah, exactly that. I don't think there was some concerted effort to tamper the New Testament text that succeeded. We have various streams and various manuscripts, and even if somebody had tried, and in fact, probably there were people that did try, like Marcion to some degree, or Codex Beza probably is some kind of, if not that scribe, someone before him, some kind of concerted effort to edit the text of the New Testament, at least in the Gospels and Acts. And, it didn't work. It didn't succeed. It failed.
Yeah, and Timothy Mitchell got into some good points about that in our interview, and he brought up some excellent thoughts to consider about how churches easily detected tampering that way. And he gave an example with Jerome and something that he did in the Psalms that somebody picked up on pretty quickly that was tampered with. And since we're on textual variants, let's hit a couple of these. And I know that people can get emotionally attached and charged in some of this, so we recognize that, but people keep asking questions. When are we going to see some of the variances dealt with? So that's exactly what we're going to do here. And since we've just discussed a couple of them, there's one that's just been recently brought to people's attention in the new update of the Nestle and Allen 28th edition. And in fact, Elijah Hickson wrote on this and asked questions about consideration, because he's over there with Tyndale, and they didn't make this change in their text. In 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 10. And in fact, Peter, when I was debating Nick Sayers recently on his work on Revelation 16:5 and my work on John 7:53 through 8:11, he basically called our position hypocritical on conjectural emendations because of 2 Peter 3:10, which I don't think he can make the same argument, because the reading is in Coptic in 2 Peter. But they're basically saying that, you guys are being hypocritical about these conjectural emendations in the TR, but you have them in your new editions. And that's one of the reasons, actually, Elijah wrote that article or that blog that he did to say, we need to reconsider this. What do you think? Here's the evidence. What's your thoughts about the new update on the Nestle and Allen 28th with that 2 Peter 3 reading?
Yeah, so Tommy and I discuss this reading because it does get a lot of attention. And in some ways, it's a real significant change because it's a conjecture of sorts. Right? You can debate whether it's a full conjecture or not, but that just depends on your definition of conjecture.
Sure.
But Tommy and I looked at the CBGM evidence, the coherence-based genealogical method, in our book, and we concluded that the evidence from that doesn't actually support the conjecture. It actually offers some challenge to it. So I think the decision on 2 Peter 3:10 on the part of the editors was really was one that was not made because of the strong evidence of the CBGM, but rather they felt that the reading as it was found in the Nestle 27 just makes no sense. They were so convinced that it makes no sense.
Not correct. What's the reading difference? It's the word not.
Yeah, so the Nestle 27 says something like, the earth and all her works will be found on the day of the Lord. Okay, speaking about the day of the Lord. And so the word there, will be found, in Greek, is a strange word to use there. And that's probably why you find the variants in other manuscripts that are things like, the earth and all her works will be burned up, because that's what's been said earlier in the context of 2 Peter 3. And so something like burned up does make a lot more sense. Well, if you add the word not before found, then it also makes a lot more sense, because if the earth is going to be burned up, there's going to be this big conflagration, and the world is going to be purified in some sense, so it's not even recognizable because of all the evil is gone. Then it makes sense to say the earth and all her works, that is her evil works, will not be found, right? After that purification, that purging process has happened, okay? So the editors of the Nestle 28 just felt like the reading as it stands of will be found just doesn't make sense. And if you find the word not in a Coptic manuscript and in a few Syriac manuscripts, as we do, they thought that must be the original reading, and then that just dropped out. And then scribes found this reading without the word not, and they had to make some sense of it, so they changed it to things like will burned up, right? Okay, so for them, it's an argument about what variant best explains all the others, and in their view, the variant that best does that is this word, is the reading with the word not. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Okay.
it does.
So, do I think that's the right decision? No, I'm not convinced yet. I think the variant will be found is indeed difficult. It's a very difficult reading, but it's not impossible. It's not actually complete nonsense. It can be made sense.
And that's even something I said to Nick numerous times, is that, well, we're looking at, there is evidence in the textual data. It might not be Greek, it might be Coptic Syriac, whereas in Revelation 16:5, you don't have any language. He claims there is an Ethiopic, and I showed him how it's not the same, even in the middle of our debate. But there are readings like that, which there are editors that we see in the academic world who differ on a conclusion like that one.
Sure.
And because I don't know, did they change it in the UBS or well, they haven't done an update, so I guess they wouldn't probably have done that yet. I wonder if they would.
Well, no, they have, because so the UBS 5 has the same text as the Nestle 28.
So they did. So they would. Okay.
Yeah, they did.
And it's interesting that so we'll probably, so people will, newer updates to translations might even end up updating. So the translators are now going to have to make choices there. It's interesting that ESV doesn't have the not there. And they
the only real translation that's been done since the Nestle 28, okay, is the CSB. Now the NASB and the NRSV are currently being revised, so it will be interesting to see what they do there. But to my knowledge, the CSB is the only one that's been updated significantly since the arrival of the Nestle 28, and sure enough, they do have a footnote at 2 Peter 3:10, and I think it's a confusing footnote, and folks can read about this on the ETC blog if they want. But they have rejected the conjecture in their main text. So they have put it in a footnote, okay, and I think the footnote is unclear because the footnote makes it sound like some Greek manuscripts have the word not, when that's obviously not true.
Interesting.
I think it's just a bit, their footnote is just too terse there, and so it's easy to misread it. I don't think they intended it the way it reads. But anyway, there's a clear example of a translation committee fully aware that the Nestle 28 has printed a conjecture at 2 Peter 3:10, and they have consciously rejected that conjecture, as they have the full right to do. I think one of the very frustrating things as a if you could call me a professional text critic or something like that, but as somebody who works in this field, is people somehow think that the Nestle 28 is like the 10 Commandments come from heaven and all translators and all Christians somehow have to follow it. Well, the editors themselves don't think of it that way. I mean, the whole reason they give you an apparatus in the Nestle edition is so that you can disagree with their decisions, right? Now, obviously, they're convinced by their own decisions, as we all are. We all tend to be convinced by our own views. But they're not like speaking from on high, and we all have to follow them, right? Any pastor, any commentator, any Bible translator is fully within their rights to look at the evidence presented in the Nestle and say, I disagree. That's the whole point. So nobody is obligated to follow their conjecture there. I don't think most English translators will follow them either.
Yeah,
and
that seems to make sense. And the more that people are talking about it, I think more and more people are convinced that probably wasn't the right move in their minds. And I think Elijah shares your view as well. Let's hit another one here in Mark chapter 1 that you brought up in the book on the statement of the Son of God. In the very first verse, there's actually two textual variances that get asked about here, and that is the idea of prophets and Isaiah's name in verse number 2, as is written Isaiah the prophet in the critical editions, More of your TR-based majority texts are going to have prophets, plural there, rather than Isaiah's name. So you actually have two here, and you didn't touch on the one necessarily in your book. You just hit verse 1, but maybe we can kill two birds with one stone. What do you think?
Sure.
All right. Let's talk about that first one. You brought up in your book the phrase, the Son of God, the longer reading there versus the shorter.
Yeah, so the longer reading is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, Son of God, okay? And the words Son of God are not found in some important manuscripts, okay? So there's been lots of discussion about this variant over the years among scholars. And part of it is because, this is the first verse of what's probably the earliest gospel. And the question is not, does Mark present Jesus as the Son of God in his gospel? It's absolutely clear that he does.
Yes.
Okay? So you don't even have to leave the first chapter before you have the baptism of Jesus, and the voice from heaven says, "You are my son, my beloved, in you I am well pleased." Well, clearly he's the Son of God because the voice speaking is God's. Okay? So you didn't have to get out of the first chapter before it's clear that he's the Son of God. Okay? And then that theme of him being the Son of God is a really important one in Mark. So it's you find it on the lips especially of demons, demonic forces, and then climactically you find it in Mark's gospel at the crucifixion, where the centurion of all people, right, a non-Jew, sees how Jesus dies and says, "Surely this man was the Son of God." Okay, so I think the question is not, does Mark present Jesus as the Son of God? He absolutely does. That's clear. The question is, does he want us to read his whole gospel knowing that from the very first verse or not? Okay, does that make sense? And
Yes.
that does have some effect. Okay, now either way, by the time you get to verse 11 of chapter 1, as a reader, you should know, okay, he's the Son of God. All right, and I should read the rest of the book that way. But it's partly a question of how does he introduce it? And some people even read verse 1 of Mark, and I think this is probably fair, as almost like a title to the gospel. It's not the first verse per se, it's actually the title. This is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and now he's going to tell us that story. Okay. So now the issue is, scribes sometimes had a tendency to expand titles for Jesus. So for example, if they came across a place in the Gospels where the Gospel writer says, "And Jesus said," a scribe might well be tempted to change that to, "And Jesus Christ said."
Yes.
Okay. And then if a scribe was very pious, he might get real excited and say, "Jesus Christ our Lord." Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah.
So there's just this tendency of scribes who they reverenced Christ, appropriately so, and they naturally sometimes brought that reverence back into the text where it hadn't been originally, okay, and expanded titles for Jesus. I'm not sure we have an example. Tommy Wasserman's done work on this. I don't think he's found an example of this particular expansion in the Gospels, where Son of God is an expanded phrase, but we certainly do have other titles of Jesus that clearly get expanded. So you find it in one or two manuscripts, so it's clearly not original. And the best explanation is that the
especially in the epistles. It happens in the epistles all the time with Paul.
Right, exactly. Okay, so that's a common enough mistake that scribes make, and so that's a good enough explanation for how that would have gotten changed. So then the argument is the shorter reading is original. Mark originally wrote the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and then later a scribe said, "Hey, he's not just Jesus Christ, he's the Son of God." Okay. On the other side, there's a very good explanation for how those words could have gotten left out by accident. Yeah. And that is because the words Son of God both end with the same letters as actually the 3 or 4 words before it. Okay. And even in their abbreviated form, they still end with the same letter. And so it's a very common mistake where scribes accidentally leave out words because they share the same ending as the words before them. Okay. It's cool.
And talking about the nomina sacra as well. That's Correct. What the people will see in the manuscripts. They Correct. Shorten it. That's what you mean by it. And some people would probably need that clarity, so I'd throw that in there.
That's fine. And some people have argued because of those nomina sacra, they naturally draw attention to themselves, and so a scribe wouldn't be likely to make the mistake there because the text is visibly different, so they'd be kind of more observant. The problem with that argument is I can show you clear examples from later manuscripts where that's exactly what the mistake scribes made. So I think in the chapter I talk about a manuscript that I was able to look at in Italy a couple years back. And I got to spend a couple hours with this manuscript, and it's actually a complete or near complete New Testament, which is pretty rare. And on page after page after page of this manuscript, the scribe had added things in the margin. And in checking through all these, oftentimes it's because he had, in his first go through, his first copying, he had left things out accidentally. And I found that in a large percentage of these cases, you could explain the omission through this same type of mistake of the same letters of the words before of the words he left out, right? Okay. And in fact, it just so happens that two of the words he leaves out are Son of God in Mark 1:1. And on the very same page, he's left out another phrase in Mark 1:1 because of the exact same mistake. So it's absolutely clear to me that that particular scribe left out the phrase Son of God because of a simple mistake. It's the same mistake he makes over and over and over and over again.
So you're looking at the tendency then. You're looking at the tendency.
That's exactly right. So I'm not just making this up. It's not just like, well, he could have done this. I'm saying, no, he actually did do this. He actually made this mistake over and over and over again, right? So there's no reason to think that he didn't make that same mistake in Mark 1:1. And if he could make that mistake in Mark 1:1, even with the nomina sacra, there's no reason to think that an earlier scribe in, say, the 1st or 2nd century couldn't make that same mistake too at that exact point. Okay, so for my take, I think the longer reading is more likely to be original here, but I admit that it's a difficult variant. It's one that people continue to argue about, and it has some significance for how you read Mark's gospel. Okay, but I think it's also easy to overblow the variant, and so I think Bart tends to do this. I think he tends to read this as, here's a variant that affects the entire reading of Mark's gospel, and I think, well, I don't think so. Not if you're reading Mark well. If you're reading Mark very poorly, then maybe it does, but I don't think so.
And this goes back to what you emphasize in the book, that, and Dr. Wallace does this all the time. It doesn't affect a cardinal. It doesn't remove any cardinal doctrine. It may affect it in some way, but we didn't lose the doctrine of Jesus Christ being the Son of God in the Gospel of Mark on this variant. How we view the introduction to it is changed. But we didn't lose a doctrine when we look at it from Mark's. Now, hit that, like, next words. We're running into
that. Okay, so then the next variant in the beginning of Mark is the question of whether he quotes the prophet or the prophets. Okay, we know the quotation is a double quotation. Okay, from
Malachi and Isaiah.
Yep, from Malachi and Isaiah. Right. Okay. But the Nestle-Aland text says, behold, before that, he says, just as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, okay? And some manuscripts have, instead of in Isaiah the prophet, they have in the prophets, okay? And that, to me, looks like a very clear case where scribes have seen the apparent problem and tried to fix it, okay? So they've seen that, hey, this is not a quote just from Isaiah. This is a quote from Isaiah and Malachi. So Mark can't be wrong because he's inspired. So he meant to write in the prophets, right? Now the reality is, if you read Mark carefully and you read other New Testament writers carefully, they don't have any problem doing these. We call them composite citations, okay? And they'll put two different Old Testament texts together, but they'll only cite the most prominent of the person of the two. Does that make sense? In other words, of the two prophets, Isaiah and Malachi, Isaiah is by far the more prominent one. And also, if you read Mark well and you know Isaiah well, you will know that Mark loves Isaiah, right? He loves Isaiah. His gospel is infused with Isaiah's theology. So it's not at all surprising that he would highlight Isaiah as the most prominent and certainly the most important for his own theology here in verse 2. He's not saying it's only from Isaiah the prophet, but he does highlight Isaiah, and he has a very good reason to do that. Okay, so I think in Isaiah the prophet is the original reading here. It's the harder reading. It's the one that scribes would be least likely to create. Okay, if their manuscript said in the prophets, you'd expect them to fill that in, if they wanted to fill it in, with Isaiah and Malachi, right? But you would not expect them to then fill it in with just Isaiah.
Right.
At least I would.
Yeah. And honestly, that was one of the passages I would use all the time. It's like, well, the critical text has to be wrong when I was TRs, because it says Isaiah, and then there's actually places in the TR where it does that with Jeremiah and others where it does the same exact thing. So I realized how inconsistent that was later. But what explains the rise of that reading of prophets? Well, the same tendency we have to say, wait a minute now, So try to fix the text And we
And
try
the
to
irony is,
and
the
on
irony
the
is we don't want to use the same over scrupulousness of the scribes to fix things that shouldn't be fixed. Right? In other words, the thing that led to this other reading is that scribes were over scrupulous and thinking, oh, this is a formal contradiction. When what they should have done is realized what Mark is saying, right? And not tried to read him so flat-footedly. And we shouldn't do the same thing either. And then, try to do our text criticism based on such a flat-footed reading of Mark and think, oh, this is an error if Mark says Isaiah. No, it's not. Just understand what Mark is intending to do. He has very good reason to highlight Isaiah, and that's okay, right? He doesn't have to be precise in the way we might expect him to be, right?
Sure.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So oftentimes we can approach the Bible with wrong expectations and want the biblical writers to be more precise than they had any reason to need to be.
Yeah, and we can't let our understanding dictate what Mark would have wrote. That's not
Right.
how we deal with that. So let's hit another one here. This one is definitely emotionally charged, emotionally attached to a phrase that, Good Friday services, when they're doing the sayings on the cross. This one comes up in Luke 23, verse 24. This one gets asked quite a bit too, and most people don't realize it's there, but once they do, they get really concerned with these words.
Yep. So this is a tough one, right? That's why I discuss it in my chapter. So one of the things I wanted to do in my chapter was not take all the easy variants, but actually take some of the harder ones on and say, what do we do with these, especially theologically? So this one is hard because in some very important early manuscripts, P75, B, the first hand of D, W, etc., the early Syriac, do not have this prayer of Jesus where he says, and Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Okay? And then they divided his garments and cast lots. The problem with this one is, besides the fact that you have very early and good manuscripts that don't have it, is you have this question of why would any scribe want to remove it? Okay? And here's where we have to think very carefully about the potential differences between the early church and us today, okay? So we might not be able to think of any reason why we would ever want to remove it, but that's not the right question. The question we have to ask historically is, would they have had any reason to remove it? And here's where the debate swirls around this particular variant, okay? So on the one hand, you have these early manuscripts that don't have it, but on the other hand, you do have early Christian writers who are actually troubled in one way or another by this prayer. They're troubled theologically by it, okay? And sometimes they're troubled by it because Jesus seems to offer forgiveness to either to the Jewish people or to the Romans, depending on how you read it. And if it's to the Jewish people, they're thinking, well, we know that God judged the Jewish people with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in AD 70, so either we have an unfulfilled prayer of Jesus, or this is an original. This doesn't belong there, okay? And so some people have argued in detail that this prayer was removed because they were troubled by it theologically, okay? And so they thought, hey, this prayer was not actually fulfilled, so he must not have actually prayed this, okay? Other suggestions on the other side are that this prayer is not original to Luke and it was added later, perhaps under the influence of someone like Stephen in Acts, who prays a very similar prayer when he's being martyred, right? So he's being stoned and he prays a similar prayer for his persecutors, for his killers, okay? And so maybe early Christians thought, hey, this is an incredible prayer from Stephen, but Jesus has to do better than Stephen, so we need to have a prayer from Jesus. Other people have tried to suggest more elaborate reasons, like that they needed 7 last words of Jesus and they only had 6, and so they added this one as the 7th. I find that pretty unconvincing and a bit too, it's a bit hard for me to swallow. That they were that troubled by 6 last sayings. They thought they needed a 7.
Doubtful.
Okay? So, but the basic problem is that it's not found in some of our earliest and most important witnesses to Luke's gospel. And then there's this question of would scribes really be willing to take it out? Okay, my view is that it's difficult, but it seems to me that the normal way that early Christians dealt with difficult text was not by simply removing them from the Bible, but rather by dealing with them in commentary, which is the same way that we do it today, actually. And that their normal habit was not to just cut things out that they had trouble with, but rather was to find creative ways to interpret them, to make sense of them. And so actually I think the places where early Christians discuss their theological problems with this verse actually end up being evidence for why they would not have removed it, right? If their response to their theological problem was to remove it, then they wouldn't have needed to comment on it at all, right? They would have just said, well, it's not original, it doesn't belong there at all. But people go back and forth. I have very good friends who are better text critics than I am who disagree with me on this. So this is not one that this is not a hill that I would die on, you know. But I remain torn even since writing the chapter. I'm not 100% sure. I
noticed you didn't put a conclusion in the book.
I did not. That's right. Yeah. I did not.
I was looking for it.
I know. And I will say this, to my mind, the best argument in favor of the reading of the longer reading is, if it's not from Luke, where did it come from? Right? In other words, we have a prayer of James the apostle in an early church writing that's similar to this. We have Stephen who has a similar prayer to this. But as far as I know, we don't have any non-biblical text where this prayer is on the lips of Jesus, where it might have come from. So you have to explain where it came from, and then you either have to say, well, they just borrowed it from James or from Stephen and put it on the lips of Jesus, or you have to say Jesus actually prayed this, he was in the oral tradition and got added, or the simplest explanation may in fact be, no, Jesus actually said it and Luke actually wrote it. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect
sense. The other
sense.
things, sorry, one last thing. I know we're going a long time on this one, but the other last argument I think that is a strong argument in favor of the longer reading is that Luke and Acts have a pretty notable theme of ignorance. So where they posit the ignorance of the people who crucified Jesus, yeah, and the point of the ignorance is not to say therefore they're not guilty, but the point is to say they didn't realize the gravity of what they were doing because they didn't realize who Jesus was. They had no idea just how bad a thing they were doing, right? Does that make sense? So actually, this verse fits very well with Luke's theology.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's a good point, actually. I've never thought of that.
All that to say, I remain torn, but I can make a very good case for it being original.
All right, let's switch over one more, Peter. Let's go over to John chapter 1, verse 18. The difference between huios and theos here. You have the monogenes, the understanding. And I think that through time, we've recognized that the word monogenes is not what people had always understood too, in addition to some of these variances. But then you have the monogenes huios versus the monogenes theos. Right. And what do you say about that? Because one of them actually builds a greater case for the deity of Christ than the other. But it is also a textual variant that is now recently being brought up in the prologue.
Yep. So this is another tough variant, and people will go different ways on it. In fact, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say this. No, I should not say that. I don't know if I can release that information. But yes, it's a difficult variant. Monogenes theos or monogenes huios. This is one where, again, I think it's a good example because there's no question that difference is important. I don't know anybody who would say, well, it doesn't matter whether it says theos or huios, but I also think at the same time it would be absurd if you thought the choice was a choice between whether Jesus is divine or not. You have to be a complete dolt and not have read John's gospel at all, because the very first verse says that the Word was God.
Yes.
Right? And it's pretty clear that the Word is the Son, right? So I think this is a good example of where it does matter, and it does matter for how we understand what John is saying here at this point in his gospel, but it's not a choice between whether John presents Jesus as divine or not, right? So to me, it's another good example of how variance can affect interpretation without affecting our theology, and in this case, it doesn't even affect the theology of John's gospel at all, right? Okay. So, yeah, what's my view? I'm not sure. I don't know. I got to think more about it, about this variant. Again, that was another one I didn't resolve in the chapter.
Yeah, I noticed. I was like, man, he's going to resolve all these
No.
variances. You started with resolve, and then it was like, I don't see where he's getting it.
No,
I
no.
finalized.
And that was partly intentional. Was I wanted people to like see that it's possible to not have a resolution of some of these variants and still realize, like with the Jesus prayer, I try to make the argument that it's not like if Jesus didn't pray that prayer and Luke didn't write it, that suddenly we don't have Jesus' teaching to love our enemies and to forgive people. Of course we do. Of course we do. Like, we have that teaching in multiple places in the New Testament, and it's abundantly clear that Jesus teaches us to love our enemies, right? Now, again, it doesn't mean like I don't care if Jesus' prayer is original or not. I care a lot. But I don't care because my faith hangs in the balance.
Which is very important to understand about the textual variances.
Yeah.
We're not losing, we don't have a new Jesus. We're not getting a whole new doctrine about his person on these variances. You're either getting, it's more of having a list, how long the list of supported verses I have for the deity of Christ. I might not be able to use one. Like, even with the Trinity, we talk about 1 John 5:7. You can still defend the Trinity without 1 John 5:7, and most in church history did. We don't need it to have the Trinity doctrine in the Scripture.
That's right.
In fact, a lot of the Unitarians like it, as well as the Trinitarians. So it's not a legitimate argument to say, well, the Trinity's just gone. Y'all don't have the Trinity in your Bible if you don't have the verse.
No, that's crazy. And I think this is where it's so important to think about, what do these variants matter for? Like, I would never say that no variants matter for anything. Of course I wouldn't say that. But I also think it's really healthy to keep in mind the temptation that we all face to want more security from God than he's given to our predecessors in the faith. So if you think about before the printing press, most people did not have the exact same copy of the New Testament that, say, the church down in the next city had, right? Because they were all hand copied, and so they had various slight differences between them. And yet they were still able to be Christians, weren't they? And so I don't think we should try to ask more from God than he's given to previous Christians. Does that make sense? In other words, we should be careful about what we require from God in order to be Christians. And in the case of the text, I think God has given most every generation a very good and adequate text to be good Christians with, right? To base their faith on. Now, when it comes to theological debates, it certainly can matter, and that's why we care about it. But in terms of the key fundamentals of our faith, the most important elements of it, they're not in jeopardy at all. They never have been in jeopardy. I always tell my students that if you had to lock me on an island, and as long as you let me pick which manuscript I could take with me, I'd be happy to take almost any of our manuscripts to that island, or group of them, so I could get the whole New Testament. You know, the only exception is Beza. I would not want to take Beza. Okay,
crazy Uncle Bob.
But give me Vaticanus or Sinaiticus. Give me some Byzantine manuscript like 35. That would be great. That would be a great version of the Bible. And I think it's really helpful to remember this in discussions with TR people. I always try to make a point of saying that TR is a good version of the New Testament.
Yeah.
It's not the best we can do, and I think we can do better, and so we should do better. But it's still a good version of the Bible. I don't think it's going to lead you astray theologically, right? So treasure it, and I think we can do better, and so I do better. I encourage my students to do better. That's why they use the Nestle Aland and not a TR. But I don't think my brothers and sisters who use the TR and base their faith on the TR are misled by the TR itself. I think they're misled in their view of the TR, but I don't think they're misled by the TR itself. It's still the Word of God.
Amen. Right. And that's good to hear, because there will be people that watch this that still hold that position. We have kind of a bridged group of people that are listening in, probably because they don't like us as much. And then you have people that have actually been influenced over the last 5 years by John and myself and some of these other members who have changed their textual view in the last few years with some of the material we've put out. So there's a lot of people that'll be listening to hear that, and they need to hear somebody like yourself say those things. So that's very important. Well, Dr. Gurry, appreciate you helping us, and we're going to get this thing out there for people, and appreciate all the work that you're doing in the field. You're making our job a little bit easier by doing the groundwork that most of us, don't have the time or energy to do. So we appreciate you helping the church, and we appreciate that you're doing a ministry with Dr. Mead where you're actually getting into the local churches and teaching this stuff. I think that is huge, and my respect levels for you and Dr. Mead are very high because of the work you're doing there. So I appreciate you coming on. I appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us on this program.
It's great. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.